We're continuing our study of the last thing we have that was written by the Apostle Paul. It's the second letter he wrote to a pastor named Timothy. Paul wrote it from one of the most cruel prisons in history. As we saw last week, it was a dungeon in Rome's Mamertine prison, a pit about 30 feet around under the building. Paul would have been one of about 30 others crammed into a space about the size of a large living room. It was kind of like the place in the Roman justice system to hold people before they were executed. So people in there pretty much knew what was next for them. It was just a question of when and how they would die. Many died from just being in the dungeon, and they were pushed through what was basically a sewer drain in the floor. And as Paul was writing this letter, he sensed his death was near. And he wrote, "The time is fast approaching for my release from this life, and I'm ready to be offered as a sacrifice." While he seemed to be at peace with that, he did mention with a sigh, "Only Luke is with me." It can be easy to see Paul as some kind of a spiritual superhero who had all these extraordinary experiences we can't relate to. But that little line can leave you nodding your head with him. He was lonely. Later, he asked Timothy to bring him a coat because he was cold, and he asked for some of his books. And those kinds of things can make Paul much more relatable. Now, Luke would not have been down in that stone walled pit with Paul. He would have been in the upper part of the prison, where he would have sat on the floor and talked to Paul through the hole prisoners were dropped through. Paul may have spoken the words to this letter while Luke wrote them down. Whoever wrote them, try to imagine what it was like to hear their conversations for the other inmates, for their family and friends, and for the prison staff. This was around 67 AD, less than 40 years after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. So that means it would have been about 35 years since God began to radically transform Paul, taking him from the key person behind a movement that silenced and slaughtered the first followers of Jesus to someone who gave his life telling people about Jesus. And his refusal to stop talking about Jesus and his passion to help others learn to talk about him had Paul on death row when he wrote to Timothy. Getting the letter to Timothy was no small task. He was about 1,400 miles away in Ephesus. And this is another example of why we need to force ourselves to not see things through our culture or what we're accustomed to. I could use my phone to get a message to my mom in Canada like in an instant. And as you're watching this, you could be sending messages to people all around the world. It would have taken weeks to get this message to Timothy. Think like getting from Torrance, California to Mazatlan, Mexico, but without a vehicle or a boat with a motor. To deliver this letter, someone had to travel over deserts, brutal hills, and dangerous water. And today, we're going to try to get an understanding, or a better understanding, of what it would have meant to Timothy to get this letter, to be reconnected with Paul. Not physically, at least not yet, but think about your phone buzzing and you glance at the screen and it's a call from that special friend you haven't heard from in months, maybe longer. And to track Paul and Timothy's story and why their relationship was so special, we need to go back to Acts chapter 14. Acts 14, the whole book of Acts, was written by Luke, the same person who was with Paul in the Mamertine prison when he wrote 2 Timothy. In Acts 14, Paul was in Iconium on his first ministry journey. Luke reported Paul and Barnabas went to the Jewish synagogue and preached with such power that a great number of both Jews and Greeks became believers. Hold on to that phrase, Jews and Greeks. It'll come up later. A very important dynamic in this whole letter. A great number of both Jews and Greeks became believers, but most people were divided in their opinion about them. That division of opinion about Jesus turned violent, and a mob of Gentiles and Jews, along with their leaders, decided to attack and stone Paul and Barnabas. And Paul was not easily intimidated, but this time he moved on, and the next stop was in the town of Lystra. We find out later that was Timothy's hometown. That means Timothy would have seen, or at least heard about, a crazy scene that unfolded there as Paul and his crew first began to settle in. And Paul started doing what he always did, talking and preaching about Jesus. Well, one day, one of his listeners was a man who had been crippled since birth. He had literally never taken a step. The man caught Paul's attention, and apparently the Holy Spirit let Paul know the man was really getting what he was saying about Jesus. Nobody would have known that kind of a supernatural connection was being made, so they all must have thought Paul had lost his mind when he told the man to stand up. Well, they didn't have long to think about how crazy that was because, as Luke reported, the man jumped to his feet and started walking. If you've ever lived in a small town, you likely know how something like that can make a place like Lystra go crazy. People flocked to Paul and Barnabas. Much to Paul's disgust, they started worshiping them as gods, which is easy to imagine with the way many people respond to celebrity pastors and preachers today. Well, Paul tried to calm the people down and show them how wrong they were to be treating them like that. Before long, another mob of people started listening to some other people who had showed up, and those other people tried to convince the locals that Paul was fake, was crazy, and was dangerous. And as Luke wrote, they got the people so stirred up, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of town, thinking he was dead. But he continued, as the believers gathered around him, he got up and went back into town. Who does that? That must have been quite a night, although Luke didn't mention anything about it. He simply reported that the next day Paul left with Barnabas, headed for Derbe. We don't know how long they stayed there, but they eventually headed back to and through Lystra, where, as Luke wrote, there was a young disciple named Timothy. And Luke continued, his mother was a Jewish believer, but his father was a Greek. And he added, Timothy was well thought of by the believers in Lystra and Iconium, so Paul wanted him to join them on their journey. Now, notice the first thing Luke wrote about Timothy was that his mom was a Jew and his father was a Greek. A study of that part of the story in that culture at that time would show what life would have been like for Timothy growing up in a home with such mixed core beliefs. It would also show some of the reasons Timothy would have been so effective in ministry, being able to build bridges between two very distinct cultures. The name Timothy meant honoring God. So apparently mom had some influence in picking his name at a time when your name meant much more than it does for most of us. That doesn't automatically show his mom was a believer when Timothy was born, but she knew her Jewish roots and took at least some of its traditions seriously. Later, Paul mentioned Timothy heard and learned the Holy Scriptures from his earliest days. That could have happened if she had been a committed Jew and not necessarily a believer yet. The Bible doesn't tell us when or how either Timothy or his mom came to have saving faith in Jesus, although it may be an example of how seeds from the Bible planted in children or in adults can take root and can sprout decades later. Well, even though mom got to give him a good Jewish name and made sure he knew about God, dad must have had some influence when it came to the matter of circumcision, because Timothy didn't experience that Jewish custom until Paul came along. Luke wrote, Paul wanted to recruit him for their mission, but first took him aside and circumcised him so he wouldn't offend the Jews who lived in those parts. We don't have time to get into this, but public baths, emphasize public baths, were extremely common back then, and that's how the Jews would have known about that part of Timothy's story. And that first journey with Paul led to an extremely close relationship as they traveled and ministered and lived together for over a decade. Paul told the Christians in Philippi, I have no one else like Timothy, like a son with his father. He has served me in preaching the good news. The Bible gives other insights into what Paul thought of Timothy. When things started to go downhill fast among the believers in Corinth, Paul sent Timothy to deal with it. When problems got serious among believers in Thessalonica, Paul sent Timothy there. As things were getting going in Berea, a crowd of Jews came to stir things up, and the Bereans got Paul out of there, but Timothy stayed behind to face the growing conflict there. 6 of Paul's letters to believers scattered across the Roman Empire include greetings and input from Timothy, which shows how close Paul kept him and how Timothy watched and learned from and even at places taught Paul. Timothy was with Paul when he stayed in Ephesus for a little over 2 years, the longest time Paul stayed anywhere, and Timothy was there with him. Ephesus is where Timothy was when he received this heart-wrenching letter from Paul. Timothy would have known where Paul was and what kinds of conditions he was facing and what his future likely was. Just try to imagine what went through his heart and his mind when he got this letter, especially as he read the words that followed his name. Timothy, my beloved son. Sometimes if you really want to get a child's attention, you tenderly yet firmly take his face in your hands and you tell him, look at me, look right at me. That's what Paul seemed to be doing with the opening of this letter. The word for son was more like an affectionate form of child. And the way Paul used it underlined tenderness and care that he was trying to get across. The first 8 times the word for beloved appears in the New Testament, it captures how God feels about Jesus. And that was the kind of love Paul wanted Timothy and us to focus on. As one commentary put it, the whole letter throbs with the love of a father for a beloved child. Although Paul often tried to explain how his love was only a poor reflection of God's love. Even our best attempts to love the ones we care about the most are poor reflections of God's love. And we will only end up frustrated or disappointed if we turn to a person for the kind of love only God can give. It seems Timothy struggled to understand and to know that love. As with many people, it seems Timothy needed a pretty steady diet of encouragement, repeated reassurance. There are hints of that all through the 2 letters Paul wrote him. It even shows up in what is often missed as a tender and personal line. Paul recommended Timothy have a little wine to help ease what seems like what we would call a nervous stomach, at the very least. Back then, the word for wine was a common one, kind of a generic word, and it should not be limited to what comes to mind when we hear wine. So the line to Timothy shouldn't be used in debates about whether Christians can drink or not. Taken in context, seeing its place in the letter and the relationship these two had in general, it's like Paul was suggesting it for Timothy to try to help him with something that nagged him physically. And in context, it seems to further show Timothy was well aware of his need of help in the area of anxiety. He didn't keep his anxieties a secret, at least not from Paul. And beyond that, it would have become public knowledge when this letter was read and talked about, as all of Paul's letters were. The bottom line is, there were times Timothy was hesitant, unsure of himself, and even uncertain about the truth he was teaching and defending. Can you relate to that? To Timothy? Even a little bit? And go back to Paul's words to Timothy where we are today. Dear beloved child. Paul began this letter there because he wanted Timothy and us to have our foundation built there. Dear beloved child. God's dear beloved child. As Paul mentioned in the line right before that, Timothy became God's beloved child through faith in Jesus Christ. That is how everyone can become God's beloved child. It's as though Paul was saying to Timothy, before I get into anything else, I want to underline and I want to magnify the truth of your core identity, who you really are, whose you really are. Paul was saying, people, Satan, and your own fickle heart will try to convince you you need to be something else. You need to be something else first and most. But I'm telling you, you are first and most a beloved child of God the Father. What matters about us first and most, what defines us, what gives us our truest value, our core identity, is not about what brand we wear. If our teeth are radiantly white, whether we have six-pack abs, whether we're married or unmarried, if we have kids or not, how our kids' grades are, how our grades are, what political party we're with, how our business is doing, what denomination we're part of, and even how our church is doing. I'm not saying those things don't matter. I'm just saying we need to be really careful with how much importance we put on them. First and most, we need to hear and to keep hearing what God said to us through Paul. My beloved child. And I close with the words of warrior King David, who had learned to hear those three words from God and was not afraid to express it in very tender terms. King David, warrior King David wrote, like a weaned child who no longer cries for its mother's milk, yes, like a weaned child, like a baby content in its mother's arms, is my soul within me.
I've carried a burden for too long on my own. I wasn't created seated to bear it alone. I hear your invitation to let it all go, and I see it now. I'm laying it down, and I know that I need you. I run to the Father, I fall into grace. I'm done with the hiding, no reason to wait. My heart needs a surgeon, my soul needs a friend. So I run to the Father again and again and again and again. Oh, oh, oh. You saw my condition, had a plan from the start. Your Son for redemption, the price for my heart. I don't have a context for that kind of love. I don't understand, I can't comprehend. All I know is I need you. I run to the Father, I fall into grace. I'm done with the hiding, no reason to wait. My heart needs a surgeon, my soul needs a friend. So I run to the Father again and again and again and again. Oh, oh, again and again and again and again. Oh, oh, my heart has been in your sights long before my first breath, running into your arms is running to life from death. I feel this rush deep in my chest. Your mercy is calling out, just as I am. You pull me in, and I know I need you now. I run to the Father, I fall into grace. I'm done with the hiding, no reason to wait. My heart needs a surgeon, my soul needs a friend. So I run to the Father again and again. I run to the Father, I fall into grace. I'm done with the hiding, no reason to wait. My heart found a surgeon, my soul